Hi, AP Lang, it's Mrs. Cook. Today we're going to go over an evaluating commentary assignment. So just like we did yesterday when we looked at the green prompt and passage in order to evaluate thesis statements, today we're going to look at a prompt and passage from Malcolm X. So I'm going to read the prompt to you, and then I'm going to give you 5 or so minutes to pause the video and read the passage. So the prompt says, Malcolm X, a civil rights activist, delivered this speech in April of 1964. We have our author and we have context. An election year. 2,000 people, including some of his opponents, who believed his separate ideas would make the civil rights movement more difficult, turned out to hear him speak. So now we have his audience. Read the passage carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Malcolm X makes to convey his message that the fight for racial justice must continue. All right, so this prompt tells us a lot, which usually our AP prompts will. It takes out some of the guesswork for us. We know that our author is Malcolm X. We know that the purpose of his speech was to convey his message that the fight for racial justice must continue. We know that his audience was people that agreed with him, but also some of his opponents who believed that separatist ideas would make the civil rights movement more difficult. So we both have his supporters and his opposers in his audience. I'm sure he knew that was going to happen, and so I'm sure he wrote his speech accordingly. So what I want you to do now is I want you to pause your video for 5 minutes and go ahead and read the passage. So I read the prompt to you with the instructions and a little context. Now you're going to read the passage. Again, pause the video and read it for 5 minutes. It shouldn't take you much longer than that. All right, welcome back. So now that you've read the passage, I hope you jotted down some rhetorical choices that was made by the author like we practiced yesterday. If not, pause the video again, reread the passage, and jot down some rhetorical choices made by Malcolm X in order to convey his message that the fight for racial justice must continue. All right, some things to really focus on when you're reading a passage is how does the author connect with their audience? What specific choices do they make in order to really build that rapport with their audience? That's really going to help you pull out concrete details or evidence, and it's really going to help with commentary. All right, so let's dive into our commentary assignment now. Okay, we have a little lesson about commentary. And so developing commentary is probably one of the most difficult processes in rhetorical analysis because you have to articulate how an author writes rather than what she or he actually wrote about. But to do this, you first need to identify the relationship between the rhetorical situation, which is what we practiced on Monday, and the strategies the author uses to achieve her goal or the purpose of writing the piece. So, we also know that an author always has a purpose when they write something. This purpose was given to us. Malcolm X was wanting to do specific things with the civil rights movement. But how does that affect his audience? And so we know his audience both supported and opposed his beliefs. And so he probably had to consider that when developing his speech. We need to consider that as well. Down below, we have our commentary checklist. After you've identified the author's purpose and primary points, your next step is to identify what rhetorical choices the speaker makes to develop the claims. When choosing the evidence to illustrate the choice, read closely to ensure that your chosen supports one of the primary points. So down below, we see this chart. It goes over meaning, impact, and purpose. So, the meaning. Have you explained the actual meaning of the evidence? Why did the author choose this specific evidence for her purpose, for her intended audience? How does the evidence connect to what the author is actually saying in this strategy? For example, a metaphor should be explained. Parallelism is often used to emphasize that 2 or more ideas have the same level of importance, or to highlight similarities and differences between 2 more things. So that's just giving you an example of how to break down 2 rhetorical choices. Now the impact. When discussing the impact, you need to connect, well, how does that piece of evidence impact the audience? How does the choice make the audience more amenable to the speaker's persuasion? So when discussing impact, you'll likely refer back to logical, emotional, or the credible appeal. Don't necessarily say, he creates pathos, he creates logos. he creates ethos, because nobody creates those things, but they do build a logical argument. They do attempt to emotionally connect with the audience, and they do try and make themselves a credible speaker. Always remember that when thinking about impact. Now we're going to look at purpose. How does the rhetorical choice help the author achieve his or her purpose? Remember, we have Malcolm X's purpose. Now we need to, when we're evaluating commentary, see if the commentary connects back to the purpose. This is called a line of reasoning. What does the concrete detail reveal about human nature or a universal idea in order to help the speaker achieve his or her purpose? All right. And then here's a note about universal ideas if you want to look through that. Okay, so our assignment, very similar to yesterday, is we are going to use the following pieces of concrete detail and commentary, and we are going to evaluate and see if the commentary meets the essential criteria for well-established commentary. If you determine that the sample would not earn full points, meaning doesn't meet all three criteria, then you're going to want to rewrite that commentary to make sure that it would earn full points. If the commentary does earn and check all three boxes, you do not have to rewrite it. Again, here's our prompt. So we are looking at commentary and concrete detail that analyzes Malcolm X's attempt to convey his message that the fight for racial justice must continue. We're going to skip down to sample 2. Sample 2 says, by repeatedly mentioning that 1964 is the year of political change for African Americans, Malcolm X establishes a sense of urgency among his audience. Now let's look at our criteria. Does the commentary explain the meaning of the evidence? Not really. We don't really have an explanation. We really just have a succinct sentence. Does it examine the impact on the audience? Kind of. It says it establishes a sense of urgency among his audience by saying this is a year of political change. So I would give it that. It attempts it. Does it analyze how the choice supports the author's purpose? No, it doesn't. It doesn't connect it back to the civil rights movement and Malcolm X's purpose. So now you need to think about, how can I write this commentary up to make sure that it, number 1, explains the meaning of the evidence, and number 2, analyzes the choice and explains how it supports the author's overall purpose. So let's look back to our purpose. We know that Malcolm X trying to convey a message that the fight for racial justice must continue. So maybe here in our commentary, we need to mention that by repeatedly mentioning that 1964 is the year for political change for African Americans, Malcolm X not only establishes a sense of urgency among his audience, but blatantly asks them to do something about it so that they can continue the fight for racial justice. He's not only telling his audience that it's a time for political change, he's asking his audience to be that political change. So just that little excerpt of commentary that I added at the end of this sentence kind of checks both boxes. It explains what he means by saying 1964 is a year of political change, and it explains and connects the author's purpose. So he's not just giving this tiny sentence, but we're connecting it to the meaning of the evidence, the impact of the audience, and analyzing how it supports the author's purpose. So now you'll go through samples 3, 4, 5, and then back to number 1, and you'll do that same practice. Remember, some of them you might think are perfect, but make sure you think that it is, because remember, our sample that we did together, sample 2, it met one of the criterion, but didn't meet all 3, so we had to rewrite it, and we did. All right, now to the application phase. You've already read the passage, but now I want you to go back and identify 2 choices that Malcolm X employs to support his purpose. That can be anything he made in order to persuade his audience. Be sure to include 3 elements of effective commentary in each response. So, for your 2 choices, make sure that you have 3 pieces of commentary for each choice. Make sure that you are doing the following. You're explaining the meaning of the evidence. You're analyzing the impact on the audience, and you're analyzing how the choice supports the author's purpose. Make sure that you're explaining those. All right, happy commentary writing.